The unsurpassed, perfect, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Well, this morning I'd like to start by reading something to you that I first read maybe a year ago or so. This is not in a Dharma book of any kind, officially. But have you ever read something that just somehow grabs? And I found myself over the past year or so going back to this, not to the whole book, just this one passage, going back and going back and going back. And so when I was asked to give the talk this morning, I thought, well, maybe there's something here. So I'm going to start by reading some of this. Actually, I'm going to read everything that is the part that grabbed me. Now, this is written by a man. It's a collection of essays, and the one that I'm reading from is actually written about 15 years ago, and I only mention that because when I start reading, you'll see that it's actually something that's everybody's talking about right now. He was talking about it back then as well. He's an unusual person because he's both a theoretical physicist and a novelist and writer. He's taught at Harvard, MIT, Princeton, and I believe right now he's holding a humanities chair at MIT. So he's a man of many talents and interests. So, he starts this chapter. Not long ago, while sitting at my desk at home, I suddenly had the horrifying realization that I no longer waste time. It was one of those rare moments when the mind is able to slip out of itself, to gaze down on its convoluted gray mass from above, and to see what it is actually doing. And what I discovered in that flicker of heightened awareness was this. From the instant I open my eyes in the morning, until I turn out the lights at night, I am at work on some project. For any available quantity of time during the day, I find a project. Indeed, I feel compelled to find a project. If I have hours, I can work at my laptop on an article or book. If I have a few minutes, I can answer a letter. With only seconds, I can check telephone messages. Unconsciously, without thinking about it, I have subdivided my waking day into smaller and smaller units of efficient time use until there is no fat left on the bone, no breathing spaces remaining. I rarely goof off. I rarely follow a path that I think might lead to a dead end. I rarely imagine and dream beyond the four walls of a prescribed project. I hardly ever give my mind permission to take a recess, to go outdoors and play. What have I become? A robot? A cog in a wheel? A unit of efficiency myself? Does that sound familiar? And I found it interesting that it was written that long ago, because I don't even think social media had been introduced, at least not widely, 15 years ago. I could be wrong, but now he has a few other things. There are a lot of versions of this. I heard someone telling their story on NPR the other day about gaming addictions, which I didn't realize existed, but essentially, all your waking hours, just we all know about the compulsion to look at your cell phone every 5 seconds. And how many parents are worried because their children never go outside and climb a tree? They're busy climbing virtual trees in their bedroom with the door closed. So now he switches gears just a bit. I can remember a time when I did not live this way. I can remember those days of my childhood when I would walk home from school by myself and take long detours through the woods. With the silence broken only by the sound of my own footsteps, I would sit on the banks of Cornfield Pond and waste hours watching tadpoles in the shallows or the sway of water grasses in the wind. My mind meandered. I thought about what I wanted for dinner that night, whether God was a man or a woman, whether tadpoles knew they were destined to become frogs. What would it feel like to be dead? What I wanted to be when I became a man, the fresh bruise on my knee. When light began fading, I wandered home. I've thought ever since I read that, I can't remember if I did that or not, but I must have. I think we all must have, but we don't remember. And this made me think, the story when they tell the story of the life of the Buddha, about when he was a child at the, Harvest Festival, and I guess he got bored with what was going on or whatever, but he just sat under the tree and just slipped into a place of peacefulness and quiet, and that's what he remembered when he went to sit himself under the Bodhi tree. My own grandson, who's now getting close enough to teenage years that I'm not sure he does it so much, but when I go down to visit, he used to say, I don't remember how he described it, but he was letting his parents know that this was his daydreaming time. And he would just flop down like on the couch in the middle of the room, completely still, just daydreaming. Wonderful, So, the roots are there. We just don't remember. And then he asks a question. What have I personally lost when I no longer permit myself to waste time? When I never let my mind spin freely without friction from projects or deadlines? When I never let my mind think about what it wants to think about? When I never sever myself from the rush and heave of the external world? What have I lost? I believe that I have lost something of my inner self. By inner self, I mean that part of me that imagines, that dreams, that explores, that is constantly questioning who I am and what is important to me. My inner self is my true freedom. My inner self roots me and to the ground beneath me. The sunlight and soil that nourish my inner self are solitude and personal reflection. When I listen to my inner self, I hear the breathing of my spirit. Those breaths are so tiny and delicate, I need stillness to hear them. I need aloneness to hear them. I need vast, silent spaces in my mind. Without the breathing and the voice of my inner self, I am a prisoner of the world around me. Worse than a prisoner, because I do not know what has been taken away from me. I do not know who I am. He calls this chapter Prisoner of the Wired World. So he ends with this huge question. What do I want? How do I want to be? Do I want to continue like this? And also an acknowledgement of the very important something that doesn't seem to be there any longer. And I'd like to suggest that his story is actually our story. Not the same details, but we all have a story of living a life which I know from my own experience appears to be quite satisfying, or not. Going through and all having spent time as a child, probably living and imagining in a way. I can remember that. I can remember imagining in a way that we don't do as adults any longer. And all of us, when we walk into this practice or any other spiritual practice, have a question whether we at this point have articulated it for ourselves or not. I know I certainly didn't come here because my life was a wreck. It had nothing to do with that. It was like everybody, it was fine. But there was a basic something which I hadn't articulated, and but yet I knew there was something I needed to do. I'm going to draw some comparisons which you may or may not agree are quite reasonable here. But his description of what his daily life is like? I think of that as mindfulness gone crazy. It's mindfulness gone mad. It's like when we first come to the monastery and they hand us a broom and say, "Will you sweep the porch?" It's like, I'm sweeping, and you come out and sometimes 20 minutes later the porch still isn't done because we've been doing it inch by inch, absolute focus. Mindfulness practice is, some people describe it as living in the eternal now, but the eternal now is more than just sweeping. But this man managed somehow to narrow his focus so much that other things were never allowed to intrude. Now, the nice part of it is, when we come to practice, we're coming to convert our life, not erase it. I'm talking about the life that exists before you first walk into the door of meditation instruction or however else you come. Nothing is wasted. Everything gets used somehow. And so, for someone who finds themselves in the position that he does, well, it's more a matter of relaxing the hand. And for the rest of us, it's learning how to not just let everything slide right through our fingers. We use what we come with. And so when we come to a religious practice, the seeds of our practice are already there. We bring them in the door with us. That's what we have to work with. I have a note here. I said that his relationship to his daily work and his tasks and his projects is as though we got up in the morning, came to the meditation hall, and followed our breath, and continued to do it until we went to bed every night. Just follow the breath. Just follow the breath. I don't mean to be disrespectful about that practice of meditation, but it's extreme. This is actually the seventh step of the Eightfold Path, the concentration aspect of our meditation practice. And it has a lot of value. I was reading one of John Sumeto's books the other day, and he said, the good thing about starting by following the breath is that it is completely boring. In and out, in and out, in and out. But how much in your life sometimes is completely boring? So what we learn, one thing we learn in that practice, is to tolerate boredom. To just accept it. Not put up with it, but just accept it. And if we can manage that one, we can step out toward acceptance of dissatisfaction or all the other things that come into our life that we would really like to not have to experience, but get on to something a little more exciting. We could look at our cell phone. Because it doesn't matter what it is that comes through the mind, it comes in and out just like the breath. So his practice of just focusing on nothing but projects, if that grip is loosened, could blossom into something that allows all sorts of possibilities to be experienced in the mind, not grabbed and not pushed away. Now, this is probably more of a stretch, but the childhood daydreaming probably has a seed in it of our meditation practice. Because when he describes what he was doing, it sounds as though he was daydreaming about whatever arose. So it can flip from the tadpoles to the brand new bruise on his knee. He thinks of it, he describes it as allowing the mind to roam. We describe it in a slightly different way, which is simply watching what arises and what passes away. Perhaps you can think of that as thoughts roaming through the mind. Dogen talks about it as neither thinking nor trying not to think. No deliberate thought. And in this part of the practice, we're in the eighth step on the Noble Eightfold Path. The two aspects of meditation. I think one of the most important things that we do in this type of meditation, the practice that we follow from Dogen, is to use a John Sameto's language. What do we do when we're sitting there? We're satisfied with simply being aware. Sometimes I've seen it called bare awareness. Simply being aware. Aware of what? Aware of what's passing by. Aware of simply being. I'm going back to a John Sameto. He has a whole chapter on space, spaciousness. He says, do you ever notice the space in the room? I notice all of you and the doors and, the lanterns and all of that. But most of the room isn't those things. Most of it is space. And not only that, if you took away the walls, it would keep on going outdoors. Well, our mind is actually exactly like that, despite the fact that, in days past, an insult used to be to call someone a space cadet. But our minds... Our minds can feel like a cramped closet sometime. When you have 47 things on your to-do list and you aren't doing any of them, you're doing something else. And there's this sense that builds up in the body and in the mind of compression, contraction. It's almost a physical discomfort. And actually, the mind is totally spacious. It's just like this room. All of those little things on the to-do list really don't take up very much space. unless we make them, unless we allow them. Kind of like when you have a nightmare and the spider in your nightmare is as big as a Saint Bernard. We can do the same thing with the lists, which in a way is when the author was talking about his projects, he's obviously got a project that fits every size. And he doesn't even have to think about it anymore. I can't do this, that'll fit. I can't do this, I have time for that. So when our mind is filled with thoughts, we no longer see the spaciousness. And the spaciousness of our mind is where our practice rests. I read a question and answer in a book, and the person was saying, how can I go sit down in meditation when I'm so agitated my mind is just spinning and carrying on? How can I just sit down? I can't. And the person answering it said, well, you just sit down, and the obvious, there it all is, your agitated mind is simply spinning in the spaciousness of your mind. There's plenty of room for that. All you have to do is sit there and let it spin. Just don't keep spinning it. Tons of space for that. The author's last question, is what have I lost when I no longer waste time? I think we talk about the mind that seeks the way, the arising of the aspiration for enlightenment. That little critical place he is where he's willing to ask that question. That's the starting place for all of us, whatever our question may be. There comes a moment when the question really matters and the answer really matters. He says, I do not know who I am. And that's the voice that is ready to ask for help. I do not know who I am. Those kinds of questions quite often are not the ones that we find answers to. Well, actually, we find answers to them, but not in the way we would like to find the answers to them. There's a book called Stopping and Seeing that was written by a Chinese monastic in the 6th century. And the stopping and seeing that he's talking about, which is our meditation practice. We stop. We're mindful of our body sitting. We're aware of where we are. And we see. We look at what is passing through the mind. He describes it as stopping delusion and seeing truth. I do not know who I am. The answer probably will look nothing like the question, because we're now stepping directly into the place where there are no words. Draw a picture of God. There's no words, no picture. Dogen talks about studying Buddhism being the same as studying oneself. But he then goes on to say that when you really start studying the self, I do not know who I am. What happens? We forget about ourselves. I was reading something the other day where there was a definition of nirvana, which was a lot different than being the cessation of suffering. It said that nirvana is ultimate reality. What's that? No words. I do not know who I am. Seeing things exactly as they are, no words to describe it. Now, what is interesting is in this very first paragraph, he says something remarkable. It was one of those rare moments when the mind is able to slip out of itself, to gaze down on its convoluted gray mass from above, and to see what it is actually doing. So that he was not sitting there thinking about something. He was sitting there and was open, so that, sometimes I think there's one definition of the eighth step on the eightfold path of being insight. In that moment, he relaxed the grip that his mind has on his thoughts, and he was suddenly able to see something which he could have never consciously worked out. When we talk about insight, it could be so many things. I can sit there and suddenly realize why I'm so crabby today. Isn't there a way I can be kinder and more gentle with other people? These are not conscious questions. Why me? But the key is, we may have these questions and we may be able to see something, but it's never anything that we can sit down and figure out. You can't figure out why me, but something can come, which is sort of a little or a big aha. The other part that comes from this kind of practice is the dissolving of the boundaries, and to study the self is to forget oneself. Well, we also can forget our boundaries. We talk a lot about all is one and all is different. But it's possible, maybe only in brief snatches, to experience oneself as not different, as not unconnected. Reverend Master Jiyu said, when they realize their true body, they are no more within or without. I think, for me, stumbling on this and going back and going back and going back, every few months and reading it. Every time I read it, I saw something different in it that related directly to my own life experience. And so I thought I'd bring it and share it with you today. Thank you.